concepts surrounding Solomon, the supposed greatest magician in all of the world.
Mm.
You know, who's called that by, again, every single world faith. So, you know, we have this Palladian form of architecture always related to these buildings pretty much as well. You know?
Yeah. So would you say that... would you say that the Temple of Solomon is the blueprint for the Palladian style? I mean, I guess that Andreas Palladio would probably have modeled his first sketches on the Temple of Solomon. Would you say that's probably what he did?
Yeah, well, he was copying the temples from Rome and from Greece.
Mm.
But, you know, it's in his writings that a lot of the buildings that he designed, he built on the same ratio as the Temple of Solomon.
Mm.
The overall thing that, you know, that I said that we see in the world around us still is this copy of the Temple of Solomon everywhere.
Yeah.
Alongside this neoclassical architecture.
Mm.
So you kind of have the melding of these two sides of the story again, you know. The story of the architecture coming through Assyria, Sumer, going into perhaps the ancient Pelasgians and Etruscans, coming up then through the Romans, you know, and coming into the modern world, and then Palladio and all of his contemporaries bringing this style back.
Yes.
Because obviously there was a big chunk of history when this form of architecture wasn't used.
Yeah, would you say that...
Dark Ages, you know.
Would you say that, you know, when the De Medici family and others were you know, picking up the pieces and creating the Corpus Hermeticum again, that a lot of this was brought back, and a lot of the architecture that especially the De Medici were sponsoring, that they were responsible, so to speak, to bring this back again into our world?
Yeah, you know, I think that's exactly what's meant by the Renaissance, isn't it?
Yes.
That's exactly what's meant by the actual term.
And what is it? Sorry to cut you off there, but what is interesting to note that as well is that the De Medici, for instance, don't seem either to have made a difference between architecture, art, or, you know, sculpturing, or whatever it might be. It's just it's the same basic expression. And again, a lot of the people behind the Renaissance, Caravaggio, you know, I can't think of anyone right now. I know there's tons of names out there. You know, Bernini, Brunelleschi, these people, they were architects as well as painters and sculptors, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's, as I said, you know, it's to do with a connected worldview.
Mm.
So your art mirrors who you are, you know.
Yes.
Your architecture mirrors you are and the way you think and where you feel your origins are. You know, so this is where the thread was picked up again. But even through the Dark Ages and going into what's known as the Baroque form of architecture, you know, that came in just before the neoclassical Palladian style, you still have this same reference. You know, those same references come back to the Temple of Solomon all the time. And the churches and the castles, even though they're kind of more simplified in the details on the outside, the inner proportions and the main chambers were always based on that same thing. So it's still running through there, even though the classical presentation regarding the three classical orders of columns was stopped being used for a couple of thousand years. The inner concept and the ratio of the room itself was still based on the Temple of Solomon. And that
interesting.
Got carried on again, you know. So the Renaissance brings back this Greek or classical form of dressing a building on the outside. But they keep within that the Temple of Solomon's ratio.
Yes.
And this is obviously true to its root, because the Parthenon is seen as the best example of the neoclassical, the ancient classical form of architecture. And that is based directly on the same ratio of numbers as the Temple of Solomon, exactly. So, you know, you can see that they were kind of right as well.
Yes.
That they weren't just kind of slewing them together. That they could see that was, you know, the original resting place. And so, as I said, you've got the connecting thread, or the connecting peoples between all of this is the Hebrew peoples, or the Jewish people, whoever they are.
Yeah, well, exactly, whoever they are. I mean, do you consider that to be a race of people if we're talking about it in the terms of genetics, or do you think that it's more of an ideology or style or something else that defines that?
I think it's probably, from the way that I've been seeing it up till now, I'd say that overall they're a group of people, and that the races that are actually comprising that group seem to be changing every couple of generations.
Ah, that's interesting.
It's almost like they absorb new nations, and so they have a falling away of the old group that they used to be mostly comprised of.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of, as they're referred to in the Bible, they're shepherds. Shepherds are kind of nomadic.
Yeah.
And so they seem to have been going all over the place, and what you do then is you interbreed with the people wherever you are. So you become them and they become you. So you've got this kind of constantly changing face of peoples, or who we call the Hebrewic people or the Jewish people,
Yeah.
All the way through history. And we've got that even in recent times with the Khazars,
Yeah, yeah. Some
of the, the different opinions on the different tribes of Israel,
Yeah. It's interesting also.
Overall, I think they're a group of people who seems to change almost their genetic background or interbreed with all of the groups of the area that they're locating at that period in history,
Mm-hmm. And but do you think that it's their background then that they're sticking to, their culture, their religion even, or do you think that also is evolving slowly or changing?
Well, with the architecture, as we said, with these legacy civilizations, in brackets, as I said, we always have these kings. And when you look into the majority of these big legacies, they all have huge square cities with straight lines dividing up all of the towns and everything. The estimates on the Sumerian cities and Babylonian cities is that they were 90% buildings and 10% roads, which is the same division that we have in modern America. So they were real sort of metropolis style and very linear. And so this is coming through the line of kings and empires as this very ordered form of architecture and a way of creating what they called civilized people.
Yes.
And this carries on, obviously, with the term of civilian, or a civi. You've been civilized.
Yes.
By the civic community that you live within.
It to me, when you're talking about this, to me it almost more reflects a mindset or an ideology more than race or culture in that sense. It's more about if you've been infected, if you know what I mean, of that type of thinking, of that type of meme that you're having in your mind. Because again, many, as you say, many kings, perhaps many people in Europe at that point have been adopting that idea of how to conduct or run, as you say, so-called civilization.
Yeah, a tyrannical empire.
Yes.
Which is obviously the reason that a group of people would move forward so much, supposedly, in forms of architecture or ideas, if they would change so much, is if you've got a tyrannical leader who can do what he wants.
Yeah.
So it changes very quickly. And Akhenaten is a great later example of this in the later dynasties of the pharaohs.
Mm-hmm.
And we can also connect this, back from the biblical account of Cain and of Abel and of Seth. Even if you look into this son Seth and you go to Wikipedia, you'll see that Seth is also listed on that same Wikipedia article as the ancient god of Egypt.
Yes, indeed.
Set.
Yes.
Or Setuk. And it's actually referenced as the same. And the reason that is that in most of the archaic forms of Hebrew, such as Tiberian, it's actually written as Set and said as Set without the H.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So again, many scholars have talked about this, that perhaps some of these early figures in the Bible are talking about whole civilizations. So we have Cain starting the first city, and this later on being called the land of Canaan.
The Canaanites.
Exactly, yeah. And then at the same point, we have Seth and the children of Seth, who are the Israelites.
Mm.
So, the Canaanites is this area of Meso-Sumeria, and kind of Mesopotamia, and then we have the Egyptians coming through Seth.
Mm.
So this is one way of looking at the biblical account.
Could it be that Seth, because Seth is considered to be the dark aspect, the opposite to Horus? Could it be that, let's say, the Hyksos then, or the Hebrew people that were coming into the region at that point, brought with them this idea of Set, and that's why that became later on associated with the darkness or something evil to the original or the Egyptians that remained in the region? Would you say that that's going too far, or making connections that aren't there at all?
No, not at all. They are there. They're definitely there. Set was known to have been worshipped at Abaris by the Hyksos. For a long period of time,
That's really interesting.
And even in the most atheistic, these scholars that are really just trying to pick it apart, nuts and bolts, in a sort of anthropology way, they would recount that the story of Cain and Abel is really the story of subsistence farmers and nomadic herdsmen.
Mm-hmm.
And Cain, being the farmer and the tiller of the land, being the story of how the farmers won out over the nomadic herdsmen. So again, even by these guys, the way that they look at it, we'd be talking about two totally different civilizations, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
One which is farming and one which is nomadic and moving around.
Yes.
So, and the very fact that the Bible calls these Israelites the shepherds, the good shepherds, and herdsmen and flock, and whether it's a lamb or whether it's a ram, there's always these sacrifices that carry on through the later Israelites. And absolutely, there's so many scholars that have talked upon this, that the major connection between the Hyksos and the Israelites, and perhaps this true identity of who these Hebrew people are, and why they are connected to all of these legacy civilizations, and why, again, in the modern mystery schools, so much importance is placed upon Solomon and his temple, why that blueprint was to go on through all of the rest of architecture and to be seen as so important even in the world that we live in today.
Yeah.
Every important place that we'll have to do things in terms of the society or the government is laid out in this fashion.
Well,
funerals, marriages, all the rest of it.
And with what seems to be regular scheduling in the time and between the ceasefires of the fighting that is going on between Palestine and Israel, as it were, or whatever we want to call the people there or whatever, but that's still something that comes up now and again in the media, and everyone in the entire world is focusing on this region, and it's very much because of that, the dome of the rock, as it were, the importance of that particular place where allegedly the original Temple of Solomon was placed. So energy, so to speak, and focus and attention is constantly going back to this area all the time to kind of feed into it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's such a travesty, the recent stuff. It's been going on for decades and decades. The recent Palestinian thing is getting pretty gruesome,
Of course, yeah.
And it's pretty much turned into a complete reversal of the way that some of the Jews were kept in the Second World War, in concentration camps, surrounded by barbed wire,
Yes.
Well, the whole of Palestine is like that now.
Of course, the Gaza Strip is basically a huge concentration camp, as it were.
Yeah, and, the rabbis and the imams and a lot of the people who really understand the history and the lineages properly will say that the true Israelites are those Palestinians.
Yeah. And they've done genetic differences. They've tried to figure it out. When allegedly Israel were researching and building bombs that were genetically specific and all this crap that apparently was going on, that they couldn't find